So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today we make a return to THRANDUILS halls, a little bit sooner actually than I was expecting, purely because of the last battle actually. The last battle, as you may notice, was on the Mirkwood border within Mirkwood's mountains that lie within, and I felt like this was too good of an opportunity to pass up, because in that battle, not to spoil anything, if you do want to see, if you haven't seen that one and you want to follow on with this one afterwards, then I do recommend you go back and see that one now, because in that one, of course, Mirkwood and their Avari allies were defeated by the Orcish invasion, and that would of course push them back to Thranduil's throne itself, so this is a rather natural follow-on. And it's weird because I got that one far after this one. I've had this one for quite a while, but I was sent this one shortly after I recorded the last THRANDUILS halls replay that I did, which, to be fair, by the time this one comes out will be quite a while in the future, so it's not too much of a problem. But yes, this one was sent to me by MSQ2, who is playing as one of the 3 Mirkwood armies that are on the defence, so none of the Avari are going to be coming to the aid of Thranduil and his retinues this time. And it is also going to be a full Misty Mountains army on the attack, so a very numerous army I'm expecting. So the Goblins also have run their supply of aid from Mordor dry. So it's going to be quite an interesting one, this, I think. Definitely quality versus quantity in the extreme here with Mirkwood, of course having smaller but very elite armies, whereas the Goblins, much the opposite. Starting off with Little Dash here, playing as the first Misty Mountains army. He has got some crossbows, which to be fair could be very useful if they are rationed appropriately. The crossbows, if they are used later on, could be exactly the sort of thing which gives the Misty Mountains the edge in a late game skirmish fight when Mirkwood have run their own ammunition supplies dry. If they're committed too soon, however, they will be one of the first targets that Mirkwood will try to destroy with their very good archers, and rightly so because of the stopping power that crossbows possess. Heavy Goblin Infantry, on the other hand, are definitely the sort of thing which Mirkwood will be trying to kill in bulk quickly. They won't be the sort of thing that you need to focus down, of course, because quality-wise, Mirkwood will be able to absolutely dumpster something like this in melee, but look how many of them there are just in a single army. We also have some Heavy Goblin Halberds. Looks like we've got a few units, actually just the one unit, which is quite interesting. They will be uniquely vulnerable as well to Mirkwood's missiles, but Mirkwood of course have got no phalanx units of their own, which is a big downside when they're defending alone. We saw in the last battle replay, of course, that the Morroquendi pikes were able to fill that role for them. That won't be the case this time around, however, so if the Halberds can get into melee, they might be surprisingly effective, if they pick their moments correctly. Mountain Uruk Host, a unit we didn't actually see last time, but this is the upper echelon of Misty Mountains line infantry. They're pretty much the equivalent to the Uruk High infantry, so they are actually significantly better than the goblins that are around them. Heavy Goblin Spears do have that armour piercing going for them, but that's less useful against Mirkwood than it would be against several other factions, certainly the Western Kingdoms of Men. A couple of units of Black Uruks of the Mountains who actually will be able to hold their own slightly better than many of the other units around them. That's what you get for using Uruks instead of Goblins, as limited as they are in the Misty Mountains roster. And then also some Goblin King's Bodyguard, which are actually Goblins, but they are the strongest of all the Goblins that are available, and a very common place to put the Misty Mountains General. There could be a few hidden units as well. I apologise if you can hear the wind, but it is an exceptionally blustery day outside, so you may hear that through the microphone. I'm hoping you won't, but you may hear the occasional gust. Now, over here we have Prince of Darkness, who has got some Blackback Berserkers actually, and that's where he's put his general. Bit of a mistake in my opinion, because that does take away their ability to hide, which might be important actually, because while they do have multiple HP, they are a unit which can be quite vulnerable to really strong skirmishers, which Mirkwood of course have. Goblin King's Bodyguard are here. Several units of crossbows once again, some trolls. Cave trolls are useful for pushing through lines, but Mirkwood won't be the sort of faction which will be dependent on individual lines as much, even though Thranduil's halls does have those really nice choke points in the initial phases of the battle. Heavy Goblin Archers, they can be committed forward early, they can perhaps force Mirkwood to use their ammunition in ways they don't want. Several units of infantry, some halberds here as well, and then at the back a mounted unit as well, some warg skirmishers, which to be fair could be useful as well. Their javelins have multiple uses. They can also be used to zone out any Mirkwood cavalry which might sally forth. It would be a very risky move for Mirkwood to engage in such tactics, but the warg skirmishers are ideally placed for trying to counteract such things. Then we have DF Mevin, a much more experienced player. This is a name that I do recognise as opposed to the other 2 Misty Mountains players. Got some Heavy Goblin Spears once more. They are shielded, which is nice. Heavy Goblin crossbows, more infantry, so plenty of numbers. He's also gone for a bit more of a heavy armour approach, which is understandable considering Mirkwood's love for archers. Mountaineer and Coaster here, they'll be able to hold their own a little bit better, but they still won't be able to match the upper tier of Mirkwood's infantry. We've got some Heavy Goblin Halberds here, Black Uruks, got some Goblin King's Bodyguard over there, and also a couple more units of the Cave Trolls, which can be used to create a bit of chaos, but they will also struggle certainly against the heavier Elven units, especially the Swordsmen. Heavy Goblin Spears are down here, more spears and more infantry. The other two units, or the other two armies I should say, are within the tree, so they have likely got a higher proportion of hidden units. Stewie, another experienced player, has got some Black Uruks, some White Uruk Fearmongers, much like the Heavy Goblin Halberds, even more so in fact. If they can get into melee, Mirkwood may struggle against them because of their own lack of phalanx units, but of course the downside to that is they will be one of the units that Mirkwood will be trying to shoot, most certainly. Heavy Goblin Infantry, a Ballista as well, which artillery on a map like this is also extremely useful for the attackers to shoot across the river at those initial choke points. If Mirkwood are not paying attention, that could be very, very damaging for them. Not entirely sure why the frame dropped there, but it is Froggy, who has got some Heavy Goblin Archers, some Mountaineer at Coast, some Heavy Goblin Crossbowmen, Heavy Goblin Infantry once more, some Goblin King's Bodyguard, and more Heavy Goblins back here, Heavy Goblin Spears. Likely some hidden units around as well. It's very likely as well that all of these Misty Mountains armies have got one unit of essentially very, very cheap Goblin Infantry, which are trash, but numerous. Between all of them, that is over 2,000 trashy Goblins, which can be very, very useful, of course. Now, for the defenders, who I'm sure everyone will be rooting for today after their loss last time, we have MSQ playing as the first Mirkwood army. Got some Huntsmen of Amon Lank. Interesting to see how they're used. They're not multiple HP and they are unshielded. They're really, really good at charging into units and at dealing with other cavalry, but that fragility with armour and no shield means that the Misty Mountains can use even their most basic skirmishes to be a bit of a problem against them. We shall see. Greenwood Watchers, 3 units of Greenwood Watchers is a really interesting choice actually, but as far as assassin units go, they will be really, really good at cutting their way through the heavy goblin units, and also they've got those armour-piercing missiles as well, which will be useful against the upper tier of Misty Mountains units as well. So I'll be interested to see how he uses them, but it's definitely easier said than done. Woodland Realm Axemen, Greenwood Rangers are going to be an absolutely essential unit, I would say, for carving through the goblin hordes. Hiriak with the armour upgrades, given it's a 3v5, you can assume that Mirkwood are going to have mostly all of their units upgraded. Sindar of the Girdle, fantastic unit of cavalry, and with no Bolgs champions they should be utterly dominant when it comes to any cavalry engagements. A couple of units of upgraded Hiri Peng, Wardens of Amon Lank and Elders of the Elven King, so all of the heavier archers as well as the rangers in tow. Elven King's Palace Guard upgraded as well, the fan favourite on full display once more. Upgraded Hiri Alth, Hiri Lung and more Hiriak. So a more heavy duty core as well as some of those more hidden units like 3 units of Greenwood Watchers is an interesting choice. So perhaps mostly what I expected, but also a few elements that are a little bit different as well. Another unit of Huntsmen of Amon Lank from Mac. Again, this cavalry, given they brought it in a pretty decent amount, is going to be vital to see how well they can utilise it. More Huntsmen of Amon Lank and some Bows of Emondwyr. Very good horse archers when it comes to damage, but also, as with the other Mirkwood cavalry units, perhaps a little bit more fragile than other units in that class. He actually hasn't upgraded these Hiri Peng, so that theory has proven false at the second army of asking. Woodland Realm Axemen, we've also got some Woodland Protectors. Those javelins could be a real difference maker actually, if they are used correctly. Hiriak, some Spears of Emondwyr, so he's actually gone for some entry-level Mirkwood units, which is quite interesting. A couple of units of Hiriak and Hiri Lung. We've got some Elders of the Elven King and Wardens of Amon Lank back here, and of course the Ents, which will be really useful if they can avoid some of the more dangerous Misty Mountains units when it comes to damage dealing, like the Berserkers. And finally the amazing Jedi, who has got some Hiri Lung. He's got some Woodland Protectors as well, some Hiri Peng. Pretty much exactly what you'd expect. We have Wardens of Amon Lank, Greenwood Rangers, absolutely vital, like I said. Woodland Realm Axemen, who we haven't really touched on them as such, even though we've seen them. They'll be really effective against the regular heavy goblins, but as soon as you start getting into the upper tier of Misty Mountains units, they may become less effective, but given the proportion of heavy goblins on the field, they're still a really good choice, I think. Elven King's Palace Guard are here as well. Woodland Realm Patrols, with some entry-level archers as well. A couple of units of them up here on the high ground. So, I will make a little bit of a cut here because I'm not sure what Mirkwood are going to do with their cavalry. I really doubt they're going to just last samurai across the river and charge into the goblin ranks, but if they do, it'll be a very small cut indeed. But regardless, we'll rejoin when the battle is getting underway. So we are going to join here as the Mirkwood ranks do begin to open up, with the amazing Jedi starting to shoot a couple of times at least. I'm wondering what was happening there, but yes, Woodland Realm Patrol also doing their thing as they do start to shoot into the Misty Mountains ranks, with some heavy goblin spears falling by the wayside. You can see here the cave trolls are a little bit bloodied up already. I do think, however, that the Misty Mountains are approaching this in exactly the right way. They're going to be leading the way with the heavy goblin spears, which are shielded. Yes, they're still going to drop pretty heavily, especially to the Mirkwood upper tier skirmishers, but having the spears on the front line means you're going to be far less likely to take damage from the charging Mirkwood cavalry. Also, to be honest with you, the heavy goblin spears armor piercing is not going to be as useful as it would otherwise be in melee against the Mirkwood troops, so actually they are far more useful as this kind of buffer than they would be in a few other situations. Like I said, the heavy goblin spears would actually be better off in melee against something like the Western Kingdoms of Men. Also the dwarves, although the dwarven gap in quality would still be a bit of a problem for the spears if they were unsupported. But here, in melee, the spears are not going to be all that useful against especially some of the stuff like the Mirkwood heavy swordsmen. It's going to be pretty grisly for them. Bows of Amenduir are going to need to get out of here. They're actually not on fire at will, which I applaud Mac for some of his restraint there. You don't really want to be shooting into shielded units that are in loose formation, especially spears that are fanning out and trying to close in on you. But we can see here the Huntsmen of Amon Lank are going to try and find some gaps. I mean, if they can charge into the cave trolls, it's not the worst idea. The warg skirmishers are here firing their javelins. This is exactly the sort of thing the skirmishers would have been hoping to fire at. Having said that, the Huntsmen of Amon Lank do manage to connect with a charge, and in terms of pure melee abilities, the warg skirmishers, in spite of some anti-cavalry bonuses, are really not going to enjoy being in melee against those huntsmen. But you can see here the difference that charging trolls make, and also the fact that this sort of cavalry is fairly fragile. Like, to me, the only unit of cavalry that is certainly worth it in the Mirkwood roster is the Sindar of the Girdle for that very reason. The Huntsmen of Amon Lank, you don't see them that often. And that is a big part of why. They will return from routing, but they are not so much the routing, it's more the fact that they are so fragile and they'll take damage quite quickly. You can see there some goblin infantry in and amongst all of this force. You can see here the horde is certainly arriving. Fire arrows are not the worst idea against the goblins, but there is a time and a place for it. You need to wait until they've already been softened up, seasoned a little bit with some damage, and then as they're grinding themselves up on your front line, that's when you want to see some fire arrows, because as it is, they shoot slower and they use up more ammunition, which is not what you want initially, even if they are going after the right target in those heavy goblin crossbows. So, cave trolls here taking a bit of damage, and I would assume actually that probably was a charge from the Huntsmen of Amon Lank, so the trolls leading the way, the big units that they are, but taking damage there. And you can see here Warns of Amon Lank. I'm not sure if they've used up their ammunition yet, but they could be just as useful as a melee combatant here against something like the cave trolls. Perhaps getting a little bit over-eager here, Prince of Darkness with his warg skirmishers, who have already been introduced to the business end of some Mirkwood lancers. They are now also going to suffer the same fate at the hands of some heavy spears. Yeah, and these cave trolls are also going to suffer a pretty grisly fate. Not necessarily the worst thing in the world to commit them against spears like this, but heavy axemen, they're going to try and avoid them. Here we are, yeah, they're overextending themselves. They will fall by the wayside. Trolls will always get a few kills before they die, but they are an expensive unit, let's not forget. So you do want to be a little bit careful with how over-exuberant you are with them, especially a unit that's a little bit more fragile like the cave trolls. Mevin, a little bit more experience here, showing a little bit more restraint. He's going to be getting himself into place. Those Woodland Realm Patrol are, however, taking a few volleys from the heavy goblin archers that are down here. This is a very common thing you see on Thranduil's halls. The ballista is in a great position across the way over there, and they are going to be shooting into the spears of Amenduir. But in response to that, spears of Amenduir, rather than pulling back, are actually going to push forward into this unit of heavy goblin spearmen. Again, the spears of Amenduir are going to be a superior melee combatant, but with the support of those ballistas, with all of the goblins that are following them up, I can't imagine a single unit of light Mirkwood spears are going to be able to hold this line for all that long. There you can see again the ballista bolts ripping past, and there it is in the fog in the distance. Are they going to push forward? Not yet. Mevin perhaps going to try and use his crossbow slightly earlier. This is the sort of thing which can go unnoticed after all. And look at this here from Prince of Darkness again. I mean, a full-blooded assault like this is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but you do need to fully commit to it if you're going to do that, and unfortunately he led the way with his lower tier units. This is the sort of thing which comes with time. The idea, I would say, is actually right against a faction like Mirkwood, because you can flood them and buckle their lines pretty quickly early on. But if you don't do it correctly, if you have your attack a little bit too strung out, if your morale starts to break, which is very likely when you're playing as the Misty Mountains if you don't build your assault correctly, then this is the sort of thing which can happen. And Stewie's Heavy Goblin Spears trying to back up Prince of Darkness's efforts, but unfortunately a single unit of spears is not going to be enough. Even against some slightly depleted Wardens of Amon Lank, these elves are going to be able to send the goblins packing in a rather big way, you would imagine. And this will give MSQ2 a little bit more breathing space. This is the hardest part of the map to defend for the defenders, I think, because it is wider, especially for a faction like Mirkwood, which is so quality heavy in this sort of situation in a 5v3. They have to be, because this is how they have to try and play the battle. Here Peng firing into the goblins as they move forward. I mean, there's plenty of targets to choose from. Black Uruks wouldn't be the worst target to go for. And I mean, they can scarcely miss here. Even if they miss their intended target, they're going to hit something, so it's ideal from a Mirkwood perspective. Turning these goblins and mountain Uruks into pincushions as we go through the trees once more, and Mirkwood actually seeing an opportunity to counter-attack here, probably because the crossbows were trying to skirmish with Mirkwood and they didn't want that to be the case. Yeah, these heavy goblin infantry really going to struggle against the heavier Mirkwood retinues, the spears and the line infantry moving forward, and yeah, they're going to need to try and reinforce this heavy goblin infantry fairly quickly. They're trying to take some potshots with the crossbows. But yeah, something like the Black Uruks, much more in the way of infantry is going to be required. That ballista though is in such a good position, and perhaps going after that Hiri Lang as well. The goblins in numbers here on the front line. Things could yet go sour for the elves over on this front. It is such a perfect position as well to use that ballista in. He's going to be firing onto the front line, which is exactly the right thing to do. You've already done a little bit of damage to the skirmishers, especially that Mac has doubled down on this front line to a certain extent and committed one of his stronger units in Hiri Lang. It's definitely worth your while. Considering that you've only got heavy goblins on the front line as well, you're never going to win this fight through martial strength alone. You're going to need to rely on that siege tower again, ripping through that line. A bit of friendly fire though could be enough to actually send this unit routing. Woodland Protectors just in behind, so again, still Mac not eager to let the goblins have this hill so easily, but I feel as though this is one of those situations where you need to know this is not really an ideal situation for you. Your elves are suffering on the front line, and one unit of javelins is not going to be enough to make up for the losses that you're taking at the hands of that ballista. Snow Trolls moving forward, we saw them used to really good effect in the last battle replay on the Mirkwood border. Will we see the same sort of thing here at Thranduil's throne itself? Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. And it's not too surprising when you see the calibre of units that are facing off against one another here, but this is the game that the Misty Mountains have to play. They have to play this slow burn approach. They have to try and just wear the Misty Mountains down. Because if they play that game, the Misty Mountains are going to struggle come the late game. More routing though, this time from Stewie's Heavy Goblin Spears as infantry, pointing the wrong way from a Misty Mountains perspective. This is usually the area where the defenders will struggle the most on Thranduil's halls, but so far the routing from the Misty Mountains over here has been fairly extreme. Can't argue with those results. The goblins are still trying to pour forward. Still this unit of Wardens of Amon Lank. I'm not sure whether they used their ammunition or not. If they didn't, then this could be a bit of a blessing in disguise for Mirkwood, but still, these Elven Heavy Axemen have hewed through many a goblin, and also a few trolls already in this battle, and we've only just gone beyond the 10k mark. Some Hiri Alth also moving in to back the Wardens up, and that should be the end of these Heavy Goblin Spears sooner rather than later. Greenwood Watchers still biding their time, although they have been revealed as a result of the proximity of the goblins, so that is worth bearing in mind. Just look at the goblin army though, it still extends far back across the river. So many of their number are already across here, and that is the beauty of playing as the Misty Mountains, especially when you have 5 armies of Misty Mountains that you can utilise. Over here, the amazing Jedi taking some fire from the Snaga skirmishers and from the heavy goblin crossbows. This demands a bit of a response, really. If this were just basic archers, then the shields from the heavier Mirkwood units would be enough to mitigate quite a lot of the damage. It's not going to be the case, however, for some of these armour-piercing projectiles. Here he Peng using fire arrows, trusting in their aim to make sure they don't set their own forests ablaze, but considering the amount of routing which has happened over here on this side of things, it's not surprising to see the continued use of flaming shots. And the Snow Troll's pulling back, Prince of Darkness having his nose thoroughly bloodied from that initial assault. And over here as well we're seeing more routing, which, considering the ballista fire that the defenders have been taking, we're seeing the Misty Mountains' main downside come to the fore here, and Mirkwood managed to hold on, and the goblins that have remained on the front line fighting are still not altogether sure. Shaken is the best we can offer, and there is also some wavering in there as well. Snaga skirmishers are trying to use these very basic projectiles once again over here. And those javelins have got a pretty good arc of fire that they could utilise there, so while they won't do as crippling damage as better javelins will, this will all add up. And also a little bit further down the hill we can see some heavy goblin archers are also in position, so like I said, as the Misty Mountains here, you've just got to be a little bit patient. You can't afford for this to continue to be the case where whole sections of your army are routing wholesale. You do need to be making some ground sooner rather than later, but still. Now, Hiriak and some Woodland Realm patrol which are out of ammunition forming up this front line, and some cave trolls being sent to the front. Hiri Peng that are potentially out of ammunition. This is the sign again of maybe a less experienced player in the Amazing Jedi, because a lot of his archers have already run out of ammunition and are now in melee. Not a great sign. You do need to have some of that ammunition for later, but the Hiri Peng are a good melee combatant and their presence will certainly not go amiss on this front line. But this is the sort of situation where you could do with some projectiles, honestly, because the heavy goblin halberds are pushing forward and they could be a really efficient unit. In spite of their low quality, that phalanx could be so important. The cave trolls waddling in to melee once again, swinging those logs and hammers. But they need to be quite careful, because if they stay in melee for any length of time, they are the weakest of all of those bigger troll units. I think maybe the mountain trolls are slightly weaker. They're about the same, but the cave trolls' benefits far outweigh the negatives. Hiriouth pulling back a little bit, heavy goblin infantry taking some volleys from the supporting archers behind, not the Greenwood Rangers, but the Hiri Peng. Some Hiriak which are very, very depleted indeed, but once again, there's always going to be more goblins and uruks ready to move forwards. Hiriak trying to do their thing here, but again, maybe a little bit too over-exuberant. Every elf is going to count come the late game here. I think they're trying to get the goblins to blob up so that they can more efficiently shoot them. But the arc of fire is not brilliant. The Huntsman of Amon Lank being used quite nicely there. A nice charge into the side of that unit of heavy goblin infantry. A few more charges like that, and yet another unit of heavy goblins is going to rout. If they go too far that way, they will find themselves marching into the welcoming arms of the Greenwood Watchers as well. So it's a nice little setup that MSQ's got going on over here. But another full-blooded assault, better constructed this time, could be exactly the sort of thing which sends this fight hurtling in the other direction. And some snow trolls could be just a thing to help open things up. Not all on their lonesome, however, and certainly not if they're going to get charged, although could catch that. The Huntsman of Amon Lank lingering a little bit too close to the front line there. They should have retreated a little bit further. And in sustained melee, the trolls will do quite nicely against these huntsmen. But Greenwood Watchers potentially with a volley of their throwing daggers, and that will be enough to do a lot of damage to them. One of them falling by the wayside. In fact, all of them dying to those throwing daggers. So in the end, not the best of engagements for the goblins. Once again from Prince of Darkness, it's a case of the idea actually being right. He caught those cavalry units napping a little bit, but the execution, you need a little bit of support, even if it's just from something like goblin infantry. It would have been enough to give those Greenwood Watchers a little bit more pause, perhaps, as this unit of Hiriak continues to carve their way through goblin infantry and heavy goblin archers. Not the finest units in melee, but the elves will just be wanting to kill as many of these foul creatures as they can. Meanwhile, Snaga skirmishers trying to do their thing still. Pretty decent engagement over here. The cave trolls suffering a little bit in sustained melee, but a combination of those heavy goblin halberds and also some black uruks of the mountains, which are finding their way to the front now, will mean that out of ammunition skirmishers, even of Mirkwood's calibre, are no longer going to be enough for this fight to go entirely their way. We just have to wait and see on that front. Heavy goblin halberds pushing in. There's still a bit of support coming in from the Snaga skirmishers as well, so the Misty Mountains will very much enjoy that. Goblin infantry on the front line with the armour upgrade, so that's something at least. It'll make them a little bit more resilient against Mirkwood's attention. But ultimately, of course, they are still very much a fodder tier unit, and they will not be able to push their way through this Mirkwood front line all on their lonesome, even if it is against the Amenduia units, the entry-level Mirkwood forces. Bows of Amenduia up on the hill as well, firing away. I question the inclusion of horse archers if you aren't going to use their mobility, but it's better than nothing. At least they're doing some damage, albeit in small, drawn-out quantities. Looking round patrol is still here. More heavy goblin spears, seemingly an inexhaustible supply of goblins which keep marching towards the front, but so far the elves have not buckled in any area. I don't know whether all of these engagements have been entirely fantastic for the elves, but they haven't budged yet, so the Misty Mountains will need to apply more pressure. It's a long battle once again, this of course, at 47k frames. Heavy goblin halberds pulling back a little bit, crossbows getting onto the front line. Not sure why the halberds are pulling back, because so far there isn't really a great deal of projectiles coming in through the middle over here, and the halberds would still be one of the better choices for getting rid of the Mirkwood units which are still loitering. Still no other units over here. Is there yet another renewed assault over here? Yes, there is. Prince of Darkness and Little Dash sending forward some units. Heavy goblin halberds on the front. MSQ2 still getting away with using some of his more depleted units, albeit they're so outnumbered at this point that the goblins will probably be able to force their way through the battered remnants of these units at Hiriak. Black Uruks of the Mountains also on the front line, so a bit of quality between them and the Mountain Uruk coast to be had. Are they going to try and use those Greenwood Watchers once again? They may have to. Prince of Darkness sending forward his Goblin King's bodyguard, so I like this. More quality being used. MSQ2 perhaps still being a bit of a miser in the sense that he's sending forward these very depleted units. I mean, a nice charge into the side of those Black Uruks of the Mountains, but there's so few of these Warnsman on Lank at this point that their overall effectiveness is somewhat in question. And there you can see the Greenwood Watchers have been revealed. Little Dash is going to charge forward with those Mountain Uruk coast. They're all on their own though, so the Greenwood Watchers will probably be successful. More so because the Mountain Uruk house already looking like they're routing. Some throwing daggers coming in as well. Although I have to say, they are on fire at will clearly, these Greenwood Watchers, and that maybe isn't the best of ideas. All of this tree cover being used in a pretty decent manner by Mirkwood so far. No projectiles being used still. The Black Uruks of the Mountains holding their own, but still, I have to say, these Wards of Ammon Lank have done really, really well, but their shelf life is almost up. And then, making our way back towards the middle, still, the slew of goblins continues to knock on the Elven front line. Got to see some Snaga in there as well. Snaga skirmishers, are they out of ammunition? If they are, then fair enough, just send them into the meat grinder. They do actually assist in bringing an elf down, which is better than Snaga can usually hope for in melee. Look at all of those goblin spears and halberds being lowered. More trolls committed to the front line now. 6 cave trolls, that should be enough to loosen this front line enough to the point where Mirkwood will need to consider utilising their secondary line, which is a little bit broken, I have to say, from the Amazing Jedi. Needs to sort himself out a little bit more than this if he hopes for this position to be held for much longer. Meanwhile, this, clearly, a full-blooded engagement now as the goblins and uruks and trolls try to force the issue a little bit more on this front line. A couple of units of snow trolls in here, I think, but the Ents have been committed as a result of this. More elves. There's also Blackback Mountain Berserkers, however, so clearly the Misty Mountains are very serious about trying to push their way through here now as the frames drop a little bit once again. But this is a big moment, actually, because if this assault also fails for the Misty Mountains, that would be a huge win for Mirkwood going into the later stages of this battle. Only 8 Huntsmen of Ammon Lank, but a charge coming in once again on the Snow Trolls as they get progressively more and more bloodied. The Wardens of Ammon Lank will be very effective against these Trolls in melee. This big two-handed axe is exactly what the situation calls for. Maybe not the best engagement this for the Ents, though, considering that there is pretty much the best unit for dealing with the Ents in the Misty Mountains roster in the Blackbacks here on the front line, but I guess needs must. You've got to hit the panic button sometimes, and speaking of panicking, the lower tier of goblins are starting to run away, and that is a bad sign for the Misty Mountains indeed, because it means that they are gaining the upper hand in this engagement and more reinforcements are going to be needed. Fortunately, as Misty, reinforcements and the amount thereof are never really going to be too much of an issue. Mevin has the opportunity to maybe force the issue in the middle here still. More archers getting into position up here. The Amazing Jedi with another unit of Hiri Pang. Not using Flaming Shot anymore, which I think is fair enough. You just need to get as many volleys downrange, get as much damage done as possible, but those Goblin archers trying to do a bit of damage in return. This is where the armour upgrade from the Hiri Pang will start to pay some dividends. Ah, yes, a catapult from the Amazing Jedi. Another tool by which you could absolutely ruin the Misty Mountains' morale. Once again, though, the Misty Mountains not making much progress over here. Greenwood Watchers getting ready as well. The Amazing Jedi with some reinforcements potentially. I would say you really don't want to be using your catapult at this point. Yes, it's a tempting target, but most of this is heavy Goblin infantry. You don't need to worry about dealing with them via artillery. The artillery could be so useful later on, but I think you need to ration your ammunition a little bit more than that. Heavy Goblin halberds moving in. As the Goblins continue their forward march, the final Cave Troll falls at the hands of the heavy Elven infantry. A combination of spears and halberds still trying to force the issue. There's also a few heavy Goblin infantry left alive in there, but surely not for much longer, given the kind of elves that they are facing off against here. And there the telltale thud of the crossbows. Hiri Lang moving around. I mean, they have an opportunity here to slam into the sides, but do they need to commit more over here? That is the question. The frames dropping, and another unit of Snow Trolls being committed. The best the Misty Mountains have in sustained combat are the Snow Trolls, not up to the same level as any of the other Orc factions, not quite anyway. They're designed a little bit more for mobility, but they will do the job here. And still more Woodland Realm Axemen being committed. Mirkwood not eager to give up this defensive position at all, but there's a far greater proportion now of Mountain Uruk coast, so the Misty Mountains continue to turn up the pressure a little bit over here. Can they continue to hold on to this front line efficiently, Mirkwood? I honestly have my doubts. As those ballista bolts continue to whiz in as well. And you could actually break the Woodland Realm Axeman. They are a more entry-level unit after all. Woodland Realm Patrol. Warns of Ammon Lank still fighting hard on the front line. The Greenwood Watchers, as I said, will be pretty effective against more entry-level units, but I believe they lack armor piercing, which means the Mountain Uruk Host are not the worst unit you could send against a lighter unit like the Watchers. Do they have more units? They've got Bows of Amenduia. They have another unit of Hiriak on the way forward, so another unit of heavy spears. Eager to hold on, but the Goblins are actually filtering their way through the lines at this point. Might be time to cut your losses, honestly, and try and pull back to Thranduil's throne. Heavy Goblin crossbows also in position to get some good volleys off, and it's these kind of gaps which we saw last time on the Mirkwood border. It was this kind of moment where the attackers were able to seize some dominance, and I do worry for the defenders if that isn't going to happen again. Two less experienced players in comparison to MSQ2 on the defence, And in a 5v3, that's always a bit of a recipe for disaster. And you can see MSQ2 has performed very well on his front line. Continuous routing on the part of the Misty Mountains here, and that's exactly what you need to be seeing as Mirkwood in this kind of situation. Going to be much more difficult to rout the Goblin King's bodyguard, but already they're bloodied and bruised at the hands of Mirkwood. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. Maybe overextending a little bit though. Getting into view of some crossbows maybe. The Goblin infantry is still here. The beauty of playing as the Misty Mountains, as I keep saying, Goblin infantry, yeah, they're not going to last too much longer now with Hiriouth on one side, Greenwood Watchers on the other. They are going to start to melt away, you would suggest. And still, heavier Mirkwood units continuing to hold on to this front line as they continue to chase the Misty Mountains down the hill. Goblin infantry, heavy Goblin infantry. Anything of quality. Black Uruks on the way forward, a fresh unit of them. They would certainly not go amiss. Some standard Warg Riders as well, which must have been hidden in the trees from Stewie. They'll be pretty useful for dealing with any Sindar of the Girdle that try to find gaps in the Goblin lines as they move through the open area between the initial defence and Thranduil's halls themselves. Just look at this though, it really is a grind over here. It's a grind actually that the Goblins are taking a lot of losses in, however. ELVES need to push forward a little bit more if they are to lay down their effectiveness, but it's over here still where the Misty Mountains are looking like they are going to break through first. There's not many trolls left, but there's still so many Goblins and Uruks pushing on this front line. There's a few mounted Mirkwood companies, a few heavy axemen still fighting the good fight, but there's only so much that depleted units like this are going to be able to do. They have actually committed their Palace Guard over here as well, so that is a big statement of intent from Mac. He needs to continue to do the business over here, trying to shoot in it. I mean, with units of this quality, then they could rout this blob of goblins. They are raining down punishment from something back here. Yeah, I thought it was Elves of the Elven King. It'll make it a little bit difficult for the goblins to continue to push forward if Silverthorn arrows are striking them, because that does stop their momentum somewhat. Greenwood Watchers, so to be fair to Mac, in spite of the pressure that he's under, he is still dishing out a lot of damage to the Misty Mountains. Whether that will be enough or not, we shall have to wait and see come the battle's end. How about the Amazing Jedi? How's he getting on in the middle? I'm actually a little bit surprised that the Misty Mountains have not tried to force the issue here in the middle a little bit more than they have, because I do think the opportunity has been there. Javelins here. This is one thing they have done very well in this little middle trench. Their javelins and their crossbows have found a few decent biting points, and that may very well pay dividends by the end of the battle if Mirkwood run out of infantry sooner than they were expecting. Meanwhile, Black Uruks on the front line making a bit of a difference, but that whooshing sound indeed it is. MSQ has decided that now is the time to deploy arguably the greatest asset they have in the Greenwood Rangers. They are going to try and use those body-piercing projectiles to their fullest, and against something like the Black Uruks, not a bad idea at all. Several of them already bloody, trying to push their way through the very few elves that remain. Still using those Huntsmen of Amonlank, only 2 remain. So their time has almost come, but they've been used pretty well, you would have to say. As the Mountain Uruk hosts continue to push forward, they're going to try and find what remains of the Greenwood Watcher force over here. In fact, it looks like, no, they're going after the unit of Hiriek that they can perceive. Perhaps a good opportunity for MSQ to use those Greenwood Watchers to try and finish off yet another unit of higher tier by Misty Mountain standards infantry. Mountain Uruk host. I mean, if more goblins arrive, which, yeah, more are now doing so, they can wrap around these heavier units. MSQ2 is going to send forward, so they are intent here on Woodland Realm Axemen revealing themselves, defending those Greenwood Rangers, and that will be enough to rout the extremely depleted Black Uruks. But they do seem to be very intent here, the defenders, on holding the initial defence indefinitely, so we may not actually see the interior of Thranduil's halls, which I believe we actually saw in the last battle as well, which, in that battle, if my memory serves correctly, was one of the reasons why the defenders lost it. I know that I've seen a Thranduil's Halls battle in the past where that was the case, where they just simply held on to the outer defences for too long. We've seen this several times of late, the defenders not knowing when to retreat, and we shall see if that proves to be their undoing this time as well, because the goblins doing the business again. The Ents on the front line again. The Ents actually being committed when the Blackbacks are here, which is questionable. The Wargs are coming up here to try and lend a hand against the Ents, but there's not very many of them left now. There's a few Elven Riders in there too. More Goblins arriving, heavy Goblin infantry and Black Uruks backing them up. It is a bit of a mess of an engagement, which generally speaking you would say should favour the Misty Mountains in a battle such as this. More ballista bolts whizzing overhead. They've still got stuff like the Fearmongers though, which could be so useful. More trolls. So many snow trolls. They haven't been as brutal as trolls can be so far. Fearmongers on the front line now. That phalanx should start to pay dividends, especially against, by Mirkwood standards, the more heavily armoured units. That armour piercing will actually be useful against some of these heavier Mirkwood troops. And you can see here the Hiri out are struggling a little bit, especially seeing as the Whiter Fearmongers are receiving a little bit of support from skirmishers just in behind them. Woodland Protectors, they have ammunition still, or are they purely now going to be a light to medium spear in melee? Not all that impressive in melee, you would have to say. Still MSQ2 continues to try and do the business over here, and actually, for the most part, he does seem to be succeeding. Defeat seems certain to the heavy Goblin infantry as the Hiri Lung carve their way through them with reckless abandon. But there are some trolls still over here. Woodland Realm Axemen are not AP. They're decently damaging, but it's... I mean, the combination of units over here should actually be fairly good against the snow trolls if they're all on their own like this. Still, Mountain Coast back here. So yeah, MSQ, I don't know if he was forced to because they were a veal, but he is now going to be utilising his Greenwood Watchers as a melee force. Coming forth from the trees, Mirkwood trying to make good use of their ambush mechanics. And so far so good. This Mountain Uruk host is very likely to rout before they all perish wholesale. And the Sindar of the Girdle also now being deployed. This is a good opportunity actually, as the Goblins and Uruks over on this side are a little bit stretched. A very good opportunity to use something as devastating as the Sindar of the Girdle are on a charge. Hiriak, you can see the trolls are in behind enemy lines and they are going for exactly the right target. Mevin knows what it's all about, shutting down the rangers as best as he can. Those trolls won't last for too much longer, especially not with the charge coming in, and that's going to be that. But they've delayed the rangers from firing for a little longer, and hopefully, well I say hopefully, from a goblin perspective, they will be able to take advantage of that as the blackbacks are now piling into melee. Such a deadly unit. Catapult now starting to fire once again. I mean, you're not going to be able to retreat that quite so easily, so you may as well. The trolls are finding gaps in the line, but wherever they're going they are finding plentiful resistance, and the snow trolls are going to fall very quickly to the two strongest elven units in melee, the ELVES and the Palace Guard. And more units are being sent over here now. How are they getting on in the middle though? Actually, they're starting to wrap around the Fearmongers. In so doing, they are offering up a clear target for the crossbows. But this clearly isn't the attacker's focus. They're going to continue to try and go up the sides, which this has been such a brutal fight. But the elves are actually pushing the Misty Mountains back down the hill, which is certainly a very impressive feat. The Ents at the heart of that, but the Black Uruks, two-handed unit. They'll be better against the Ents than many of the Misty Mountains units will be. I'm not sure if the Ents do technically bleed, but they are bloodied. And Goblin blood is black, as we know. It'd be neat if they could make that a thing. Defeat is almost a certainty for the Black Uruk, being shown what a true heavy swordsman is all about. But it is a little bit chaotic at this point. The elves are even thinking about routing because they're a little bit overextended, and things are getting a bit chaotic, which will favour the Horde as they are. And there go the Mountain Uruk host. A good opportunity now for these Greenwood Watchers and for the Sindar of the Girdle, or what remains of both of these units, to maybe thud into the side of these units, but I think perhaps Mevin is expecting that. because he already has his heavy goblin spears set up to act as an effective barrier against any shenanigans from the cavalry. And with yet more trolls on the way forward, they're going to try and break the back of this front line from MSQ2 at this point. Projectiles being used, woodland protectors, more units being sent to the front line. I'm not sure whether that's wise. This one snow troll continues to bully this catapult crew, which they need to get rid of that troll at this point. That's really, really good from Prince of Darkness. He's suffered a little bit in this fight so far, but that's an excellent idea, just delaying the rangers and delaying the catapults over here. Otherwise, it could have continued to be quite ugly for the attackers over here, but they have managed to turn things around somewhat, and now they are starting to push back a little bit against the Elven front line. But now, Elven King's Palace Guard moving in. That's likely to be pretty grisly for those snow trolls, and black urks and blackbacks being shot at by a unit of Hiri Peng on the high ground. On those ruins, the Greenwood Rangers are still there. Like I said, Blackback Mountain Berserkers, multiple HP though they may be, arrows will still have the desired effect against them over a longer period of time, and he's actually shooting his catapult into the back of this army over here, which, I mean, he's got a clear shot at them. More lower end projectiles in the Misty Mountains, those Snaga, trying to force his way through with cavalry over here. I really don't think this is a great idea for a Mac. There's projectiles of all sorts coming in here, which are going to be bad for the Huntsman, and also stuff like the Goblin King's Bodyguard. More so, however, the two-handers in the Black Uruks are going to be really good at hewing through those cavalry units if they stay in melee with them for too long, which is exactly what's happening here. You might rout off a unit of heavy Goblin infantry or so, but it's not worth what you lose. A fairly healthy unit of cavalry that was, which could have been very useful for attacking the goblins in more open climes than that. More Black Uruks, who have proven themselves to be a decent unit for the Misty Mountains in this fight so far, I think. Wherever we've seen them, we've seen the Misty Mountains put up a little bit more of a fight against the Elves, in the sense that we haven't seen their units running for the hills quite so readily. Still more catapult shots across the way. The Elves have managed to rally a little bit over here though, between the Palace Guard and some Hiri Peng that are out of ammunition, forming up another front line. You can see yet more of the basic heavy goblins running, and actually I was lying. There are some Bolgs champions, they must have been hidden in the trees. They are going to get in here in support of this front line. They need to be a little bit careful though, they don't want to get bogged down in and amongst all of the Mirkwood infantry. That would not be great for them. Heavy goblin spears will continue to block any Mirkwood cavalry from moving forwards as well. And several times now at this point we have seen the attacking skirmishers be used reasonably well. The crossbows once again, and that's never a good sign. You never want to be allowing the attackers to use a unit like the crossbows to good effect, and that's the problem. By defending these three outer choke points, this is much more fertile ground for those crossbows to be used, whereas in the interior of Thranduil's halls, more difficult to use those crossbows. Another sign that perhaps come the end of this battle we should have seen the Elves retreat. Instead, their stubbornness may prove to be their downfall and their undoing. Of course, they could prove me wrong. The Misty Mountains could run out of steam, but making the Misty Mountains run out of manpower is a difficult task at the best of times in this kind of battle. The Black Uruks continuing to do their thing against these Elves on the front line. Elsewhere, not any Elves left up here, but they have been using this terrain to pretty good effect. I think he should be turning his catapult around at this point, because he's got the good opportunity here to shoot into these blobs, and he may have that opportunity taken away from him now, as the Bolgs champions will probably try to force their way through and go after the catapult. There are projectiles coming their way though, and Stewie actually feels as though it's worth keeping those Bolgs champions alive. The goblins return from routing once more. Like the tide going in and out it is, facing off against goblin heavy armies like this. More throwing knives coming in, causing yet more destruction in the ranks of the Misty Mountains, but not so much that they will be all that bothered about it, to be honest. The heavier elven units though continue to hold the line. There's still Palace Guard on the front line too, 33 of them, so they're weathering the storm quite well, and they will be racking up quite an impressive kill count for themselves, I'm sure. There's still a few more watchers that could be committed to the front line as well as we go back through the trees. Unlucky maybe not to get hits there. He's not had the best of luck with that catapult, but you're always rolling the dice a little bit when it comes to a catapult throw. I'm surprised this hasn't been the case before now in the battle, but Mevin has decided now is the time. Now we shall force the issue. They've committed a bit too much in the way of reinforcements to their two flanks, so now we're just going to go right up the pipe and force the issue that way. And I think this is exactly the right thing for the Misty Mountains to do, because they really don't have enough down here anymore, but they've committed a lot to the two flanks to keep them well fed. They're going to be able to shoot them perhaps with a few javelins and a few archers, but the Misty Mountains will be able to close into melee range, and that's when the problems could very well start to begin. And I don't think the defenders can pull back at this point, because if the attackers can pour through the middle here, they're going to have map control here behind, essentially, the defensive line, and that means they won't be able to get back to Thranduil's halls. And I feel as though I may very well end up being vindicated here in my assessment. Crossbows, bodyguard, more units pushing forward. There's not much left over here, so the Misty Mountains have ultimately been victorious. Very Pyrrhic victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Misty Mountains' favourite kind of victory, that is. There's always more goblins where they came from. Not so much the case with elves, however, as they continue to try and hold the front line, but with Goblin King's bodyguard on the front, it's going to be a difficult attack to get rid of this, and more to the point, they're just going to be spewing all over the place over here. Elves of the Elven King now maybe trying to get into position. They could try and take up position on the hilltop ruins over here. That might be their best bet, honestly. I don't believe there is a town centre. Is there? No, I think if there is a town centre, it tends to be in front of the throne over there. So there isn't a town centre. Because they don't have to defend the halls per se. So yeah, I think maybe this hilltop over here is probably their best bet. It's a little bit more exposed, which could be a problem with the Misty Mountains still having access to their crossbowmen. Heavy Goblin Spears moving forward. Here he is. So the Amazing Jedi sending over too much help to MSQ2. Now he's having to scramble a little bit to try and hold on to this front line, but it is still entirely possible that the Goblins could run out of steam. All of that routing we saw earlier on could yet come back to bite the Misty Mountains. But we have yet more trolls arriving on the front. The Snow Trolls will be finishing off what remains of this unit of Woodland Protectors. Will we see some hits for the catapult? No is the answer. Going after probably this unit of Blackbacks. And yet more ill fortune for the Mirkwood catapult. Excuse me. I knew I shouldn't have had that fizzy drink with lunch earlier. Black Oryx, I mean, still we're seeing routing from the Misty Mountains. I mean, what we saw in the last battle on Mirkwood's border, the depth of strength that having Mordor and Angmar march alongside the Misty Mountains gave the attackers was significant. That was the case for the defenders as well, with Dorwinion lending a hand. But now with only the Misty Mountains, maybe that one-dimensional nature will prove to be a bit of a problem, and actually the Misty Mountains pulling back, which surprises me. That really surprises me, in fact, because I feel as though if they had the manpower to take advantage of this situation, they would have done so, surely. And the Snaga Skirmishers getting ripped asunder, the Blackback Mountain Berserkers all on their lonesome back here, and Mirkwood's Elves should be well positioned to deal with them now, as strong as the Blackbacks are. Oof. Each swing there with those savage hooked swords resulting in some kills. I'm surprised that Mevin eased off on that assault, because they're already pouring in from this angle. They could do the same through the middle. In so doing, though, they may very well have actually allowed Mirkwood the opportunity to retreat. And there are the Snaga Skirmishers firing into something like the Palace Guard. That is going to be a fertile hunting ground. Sindar the Girdle cutting down one of the Goblin Generals. That loss of morale could be significant, more so for a faction like the Misty Mountains than many other factions in the game. And we're still seeing fights. I mean, there's fights all across the field at this point. It's been a very chaotic defence of Thranduil's halls, this. You would have to say that. And all that I've seen in Reforged up to this point would lead me to believe that that will favour the Misty Mountains. An entire attacking army has perished, however. I would assume that's Prince of Darkness, given the punishment that he took earlier on, and given all of the routing that he has been subjected to. But clearly Mirkwood are wanting to retreat to Thranduil's throne, which is something they should have done slightly earlier, I think. But better late than never, and they do have the opportunity to do so. Yeah, those Snaga not going to last too much longer. The Ents easily going to be able to deal with Snaga in melee, and the only thing they have for company to try and help them out is heavy goblin crossbows, who also in melee are not very good. We'll be kind and say it, put it that way. Another goblin general falls, run through by an elven spear. A bit of overextension there, because the losses of those two generals could yet prove to be very, very important. This bridge has always been a little bit of a problem. Some units always get caught on it. Classic Medieval 2 architecture that. Sindar of the Girdle are going to pull back. There's still a few skirmishes happening out here in the open field, but it's rather inconsequential battles at this point in the grand scheme of things. And as a result, we may actually be heading towards a bit of a cut in proceedings here, because the catapult crew, their fate is not all that important. There is still some combat, but it's with routing units only. So I think what we're going to see here, player admitting defeat, what we're going to see here is a bit of a lull in proceedings as the goblins organise their armies once more. The Sindar of the Girdle will likely try and trip the goblins up as they advance forward, but ultimately, what are we going to see from that? I mean, the crew is getting back. I mean, I suppose every elf helps, even a catapult crewman could prove to be the difference between victory and defeat in the end. We've seen closer margins of victory than just 24 troops in the past, after all. Very even balance of power as well. But yeah, I think what we'll do is we will make a bit of a cut and we'll rejoin when the goblins are knocking on the doors to Thranduil's halls themselves. So I think we shall rejoin here, to be honest. It does look as though some of the first goblins and Urks actually are going to be making their way into Thranduil's halls, and actually, looking at the percentage of kills, the defenders are ahead by 5%. Is that going to be enough to overcome the attackers' late game surge that they often have in these siege battles? Let's not forget the quality that the elves will still have on full display, and we're near enough, I mean a little bit more so, but 10k frames does always tend to be the mark of the late game of these big sieges kicking into play, and that is exactly what we're going to see here as well, with Thranduil's halls themselves now coming under some pressure. The Greenwood Rangers seeing the opportunity. The fact they still have Rangers with ammunition is going to be pretty key, I think. They need to do the maximum amount of damage that they are possibly able to do. And given the fact that this is going to be a rather simplistic fight around this blob, I think ×2 speed is probably justified. And we're also going to be, yeah, I mean, if Mirkwood can continue to do that kind of damage with their skirmishes, they should actually win this. And like I said, better late than never that they fell back here, because this is the benefit that having this kind of terrain can give you. Lots of routing. And this is the problem for the goblins. If they don't have the quality, if they don't have the gumption with regards to their morale that will be required to hold on to these assaults and try and make it all about that attrition in melee, they will go on to lose this fight. Because that damage that the elves can do with their archers that they still have left, and then following that damage up with the qualities that they still possess in melee, that does spell disaster for the Misty Mountains. And it's been a bloody campaign across this kind of impromptu mini narrative thing that we've had going across these last two battles, but it could be that, Pyrrhic though it may be, the ultimate victory does lie with Thranduil and his elves, rather than the forces of the shadow. Elven arrows falling down upon them like rain, and that is the telltale sign as well, yeah, the elves of the Elven King. So those Silverthorn arrows will make it a little bit more difficult for the goblins to try and impress their numbers upon the elves, and if this sort of thing continues, that Elven shield wall is going to hold on regardless of what they try to do anyway. Getting in a little bit close. I mean, the black backs are here, but they're not in enough numbers. The goblins themselves are not in enough numbers within Thranduil's halls at this point to actually do what they want to do here, and that, Yes, indeed. 42 Greenwood Rangers from MSQ2. Woodland Protectors are still there. They still have something like the Wardens of Amon Lank. That armour-piercing bite could be so important, alongside, of course, the Elven King's Palace Guard, which offer very much the same sort of thing, albeit to an even greater extent as they charge into the side here. And the Heavy Goblin Crossbows, who still have ammunition, Mevin clearly trying to get them into a position to shoot, but they inadvertently march right into the jaws of the Elven King's Palace Guard, and that is going to be very rough for them. Another Goblin General falls. And that sort of morale shock is the sort of thing that the Misty Mountains can't really afford. The first Mirkwood General does fall, though, at the hand of those Black Uruks, but yeah, when the announcer changes his tune partway through a battle, you know that things are not necessarily developing in your favour. And I would certainly say that is the case. The first Elven General does fall there. The Catapult Crew gets committed, just being thrown in just so there's more bodies on the front line for the Misty Mountains to have to try and deal with. I mean, there's a bigger concentration of blackbacks there now. They will need to do something about them. But yeah, I think pulling back to Thranduil's halls ultimately has proven to be a good move, and that may very well be the decision which ultimately gives Mirkwood the victory here. And while it may be a bit of a clean-up job to get all of these festering Goblin Uruk control corpses away from the heart of Mirkwood, so they don't despoil the vegetation, it will be ultimately something that the elves won't mind doing, I think, in comparison to the alternative, which would have been death at the hands of such filth. Still Woodland Protectors holding on to the front line. Defeat is a distinct possibility. The problem is the Goblins still have a bit of quality in there with the Blackback Berserkers, but the support they have around that quality is not going to be enough, you would think, to get the results that they would want. Yeah, Goblin Infantry, Halberds, Crossbows still there. They won't be able to lay down their ammunition though. Like, they've done the right thing in conserving their ammunition, but conversely Mirkwood have also done the right thing by picking the defensive position by which they're not going to be able to get those crossbows into a position where they can actually use them at range. So credit to the Elven defenders for that. They still have those Bulk champions? I don't believe they do. I think they were all expended earlier on. Another unit of Goblin King's bodyguard. But yeah, other than that, this is pretty much it. Too much in the way of still basic heavy goblins left. So we've had quite a few attacking victories of late, where the attackers have really utilised their advantages. But on this occasion, we've seen the defenders maybe a little bit later than I would have made it, but they did make ultimately the right decision to pull back at the right time. They rationed their resources exactly right, and they also used their superior quality to good effect here. And I think ultimately that is what's going to be the difference maker here. Blackbacks pouring through. Victory seems certain for them. I mean, the elves can't afford to get too lax. They do need to make sure that their positions are still well defended. They still have two whole units of elves. Well, I say that, two depleted units of elves of the Elven King, but still those Silver Thorns are going to be hitting the soft, vulnerable underbelly of all of these goblins. Those blackbacks trying to find some gaps, but Woodland Protectors will ultimately be there to at least stand in their way. Plenty of Woodland Protectors still left, to be honest. There's Axeman as well. There goes yet another Goblin General, sent flying by a Silverthorn. The Elders, of course, are a fantastic unit in melee when it comes down to it as well. Heavy Goblin Infantry routing once again in their natural state, especially as this battle has shown, I think. They are not the most stalwart or stout-hearted of warriors. And it's nice to see Mirkwood use their skirmish as well. Definitely a big part of what they're all about. Another fairly healthy unit of Heavy Goblin Halberds moving forward, but they're immediately going to start taking fire, and they're already shaken as they arrive. So I doubt they're going to remain here for too much longer. So another unit still firing way back there from the Amazing Jedi. They were shooting their arrows up into the sky, but now all of these units hitting almost directly into these halberds. I'm actually surprised they haven't routed already, so I guess credit for the goblins for that. Small victories, you have to take them where you can. Those elven warriors on the front line I think will be cleaned up. The blackbacks doing their thing, but all of these arrows continuing to do the business against the Misty Mountains forces. Woodland Protectors still with some ammunition. Javelins finding their marks as well. Finally the heavy goblin halberds do rout. As I said, putting up more of a fight than I thought they would. Yes, another bodyguard unit comes forward. Goblin King's bodyguard will at least put up more resistance to all these arrows, but they're all on their lonesome at this point. The Woodland Protectors stand ready, and all of the other elves will also pile in on what I believe is the final Misty Mountains general in Little Dash's army here. A little bit further out, what do we still have? Some crossbows, and that's about it. This is going to be the end. There's not much I can honestly say about this battle I haven't already said. There are some Black Uruks that have also arrived once more. Out of ammunition here in Peng, still the javelins, finding their marks. Close battle this though, it is going to be within the fabled 10%, closer than that, 5% the difference at the moment, but I do think that that will extend in the defenders' favour a little bit more as this fight continues. If anything, the defenders have pulled their punches a little bit here in the late game because they haven't committed forward everything they could have into melee to crush the hopes of the Misty Mountains as quickly as they otherwise would have. But it's been yet another satisfying large-scale siege. Had quite a few of these. This is one that I've been sat on for quite a while, to be fair. Like I said, MSQ sent this to me around the time I released the last one. But by the time this one comes out, enough of a gap will have passed. And thematically, I couldn't resist. I had to do this one after the last one. It had to be done. The elders are there. Credit to the Black Uruks though, I think they have proven themselves to be a decent unit in this sort of situation against the elves. Yes, they've been thoroughly outclassed, but we saw how badly the goblins did when they were unsupported by something like the Black Uruks, or the Mountain Uruk host of course, with their armour and shields. Oh, he routed, did he? How shameful. The final Misty Mountains general may yet live through this day. As they try and hunt him down. Will they catch him, I wonder? Well, the goblin crossbows are ready to actually shoot the elves as they sally forth from Thranduil's halls. Pretty vicious volleys this, but they're going to rout as soon as these elders make contact with them on the front line, I would imagine. Give them more credit than that. Once again, the heavy goblins proving to be a little bit more resilient morale-wise than I would have suggested at first glance. Heavy goblin halberds returning from routing, but we are now in the dying embers of this fight, and Mirkwood will be victorious. It's been a bloody campaign, as I said, and they may view it as a very Pyrrhic victory. Darwinian, their armies laid down their lives on the borders to blunt the assault, but ultimately Mirkwood will not fall into the enemy's hands this day. But Mirkwood will need a little bit more help perhaps from their allies around them if they are to survive future assaults of this nature. As the Ents move forward. There is something not routing, I would assume. Is there not? Or is that the end? And there we go.
We have won here today.
Another satisfying battle, I'm sure you would agree. Illidan. And there we go. MSQ2 getting the most kills. Not too surprising, given the fact that he had the most successful initial defense. He started Rangers in the late game as well. The Amazing Jedi was actually more of a supporting player as well. He sent over quite a lot of his troops to help MSQ2. That was nearly to his detriment. I think actually if the Misty Mountains had recognised that and had flooded through the centre earlier than they did, this battle could very well have gone the other way. And the Misty Mountains could have really taken advantage of the fact that Mirkwood maybe hung around on that initial defence longer than they should have. Not a lot of kills from the Misty Mountains, but you don't expect it. The Mirkwood armies are very small, the Misty Mountains armies are very large. There's only so many kills to go around. Stewie did very well actually to get over 1,000 kills in this situation. See what did the damage. For the Mirkwood armies, 802 on the Greenwood Rangers. Yeah, you kind of need that to be the case in this kind of situation when you're facing off against the Misty Mounds with all of their numbers. Plenty of kills elsewhere as well. The Heary Alth getting 408, that's very impressive for a unit of line infantry. Not very many getting under 100, honestly. The Elders of the Elven King, one of the few units that did, but they were only really committed later on. The Ents also being a little bit more frugal with them. So yeah, the Elders of the Elven King once again not getting that many kills, so the price really of not committing your bodyguard units earlier is the fact that they will seem to have done pretty badly, when that isn't really the case, because the fact that they were there in the late game was the thing which made it an insurmountable task for the Misty Mountains to take the interior of the halls. 208 kills on Heary Yak is pretty good, and the Amazing Jedi, 346 kills on Heary Peng, so yeah, archers definitely proving to be very effective here, as you need them to be against such a numerous army, because you're not going to win through strength of arms alone against an army that is so massive with 5 Misty Mountains players. So yeah, big thank you to MSQ2 for sending this replay to me. Big thank you to all of the players as well for being a part of this one. That's what's coming next. Unless I get sent another scenario in the interim, as I did last time, we will be doing the Moria replay next. We'll probably follow that up with another replay from Silmarillion, and then there is also another Reforged Siege I believe I have, which slips my mind currently, but that should be the next 3 videos that you see from me. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.